Good evening, Bula Vinaka and Namaste. I'm Vijay Narayan. You're watching Fiji Village Straight Talk. And tonight we are talking about constitution making. We're grateful that the Australian National University's Professor of Constitutional Law, Anthony James Regan, is here. Professor Regan, thank you very much for taking out time during your busy schedule, during this very important visit to Fiji to talk to us directly through our Fiji Village channel.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And Professor Regan, as you would know through some news articles, that he has spoken last week at the leadership seminar organized by the Fiji National University Vice Chancellor, and mainly talking about constitution making and his background. I'd just like to say that he is an academic in constitutional law at the Department of Pacific Affairs, previously the State Society and Governance in Melanesia Program Bell School, College of Asia and the Pacific ANU. He's involved in advising and conducting associated research on the roles of constitution making and review both process and content in conflict resolution and peace building in conflict and post-conflict situations in the Pacific and some Asian states. Professor Regan, what has brought you to Fiji?
Thank you, Vijay. I was requested to come to present a lecture on constitutional change in Fiji, looking to the future. And to me, it's a very important topic. I'm not a person who's spent a lot of time in Fiji, but since 1995, I've had some involvement. I wrote a paper for the Reeves Commission whose proposals were the basis for the 97 Constitution. And then in 2012, I was on the committee of experts that was brought to Fiji to evaluate the 2012 draft constitution produced by the Guy Commission. And then subsequently in 2013, I wrote reports with colleagues for the Citizens Constitutional Forum about the 2013 Constitution. And I've continued working and writing about Fiji, but I'm not an expert on Fiji politics in particular, but I am able to at least perhaps make some comments, give some thoughts about the constitution in Fiji.
Professor Regan, just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, the 1997 Constitution went through a parliamentary process. Of course, the Reeves Commission looked through the report and eventually, after all the consultations done by the public, a process was followed that eventually ended up in Parliament. However, 2012, 2013, when you were involved in that committee and the group that was looking at that, firstly by Professor Yash Gai, but then he was told to leave, and of course copies of what he had printed were burnt in front of him. What was the difference between the two?
Fiji's had 5 constitutions in a way. 1970 at independence, 1990 after the 1987 coup, 1997 the Reeves Commission, 2012 what's sometimes called the best constitution that Fiji never had. The commission led by Professor Yash Gai developed the proposals, and then 2013. These are the 5 constitutions. So you can see Fiji's got remarkable experience of constitution making.
Just in 54 years.
Yeah. Most countries have either 1 or 2, some post-colonial states up to 3 constitutions, but 4.5 or 5, depending on how you count in Fiji, is pretty remarkable. The differences in the processes have been remarkable. 1970 was really a consultation between leaders of the ethnic communities, Itoke and Indo-Fijian, with colonial government involvement. 1990 was imposed by the military. As you say, there was no parliamentary process. 1997, there was a wide consultation process, participation. In 2012, there was wide participation and consultation on the draft that never was. 2013, like the 1990 constitution, was imposed by a military regime, and so in both 1990 and in 2013, no involvement of the legislature. It's not just the matter of the involvement of the legislature that matters. If you have a participatory process, as was the case in 97 and 2012, it goes beyond public participation to giving all interest groups, not just the main ones, but all interest groups, a chance to have their voices heard and taken into account. And that's the job of a constitutional commission, to pull together all those ideas. So it's both participation of the people, which gives the constitution more legitimacy, because people accept it, it's been made on the basis of hearing from us, but it's beyond that. It's also the involvement of all interest groups. And you're much more likely through such a process to get a constitution that reflects the real needs of the country and is accepted by the people. You impose something without consultation, without involvement of the people, and no role for the parliament as the final representatives of the people. It's a recipe for a constitution that doesn't really reflect the needs of the country and is not widely accepted by the people. And I'm afraid that's possibly the outcome of the 1990 process. And arguably, I don't know the Fiji politics as well as you, Vijay, but it's arguably a problem with the 2013 constitution.
We'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. You have presented last week on the topic constitutional change in Fiji, looking to the future. Please elaborate to the people who are not at your session some of the key points.
The key points were to some extent what I've just outlined, that we can learn from the history of the processes to make the Constitution, the processes to amend the Constitution, and the contents of the constitutions, all 5 constitutions. We can learn and compare and see what has worked and what hasn't. So to a large extent I've been looking at that history and saying, well, let's think about what processes worked well in making, what amendment arrangements are sensible and provide a balance between the need to give protection to the constitutional settlement reached in the process, because it's usually a political settlement of all the different interests in the country. So it's been a hard-won outcome to agree what should go into the Constitution. So you need to protect that from change being made too easily. But you've also got to experience all over the world shows you've got to be careful not to be too rigid, because if you make it impossible to change, or very, very hard to change a constitution, then you run risks of what's happened in Fiji, of coups and political interference.
That's the only way to
change.
To change it is to remove the whole constitution. And that's why we've had one book gone and another book comes in with people still trying to grapple. When I read a certain section, they unsure what section of which constitution we are quoting from.
Indeed. The other aspect of which I'm looking at, I looked at last week in the lecture, is the content of the Constitution. Does the content of the 2013 Constitution really meet the needs of Fiji? Does it reflect international standards that should apply? And there's a number of aspects of the Constitution which I would say are very questionable. And then the final big focus of the lecture was, what are the possibilities for change? Because of course the Constitution is almost impossible to change. It's probably the hardest to change in the world, other than perhaps some communist countries, really autocratic countries. Because as you know, it requires 3/4 of all the seats in Parliament, whether the members are there, whether the seats are vacant, whether the members are sick, you still have to have 3/4 of all the members. So it would be very hard for the current government to do that. But in addition, and this is most unusual because in Fiji we've never had this before, in the 1970s, 97, 1990, 2012, none of them had this requirement for a referendum. But not only is it a referendum, but it says, the Constitution says, there must be a vote of 3/4 of all the registered voters in the referendum voting yes for whatever change is required. Now, 3/4 of all the registered voters in a system where voting is not compulsory, as in Fiji, is a recipe for an impossible amendment process, because the normal turnout is much less than 3/4. So you don't even get 3/4 turning up to vote. In 2018, the turnout was 72%. In 2022, the turnout was 68%. So you wouldn't even get enough people, if that was the case in a referendum, you wouldn't even get enough people there for the turnout of 75%. But if you say, in addition to a turnout of at least 75%, you've got to have 75% of all the registered voters. So if you've got 75% turnout, every single voter would have to vote yes.
Which is almost impossible.
Which is almost impossible.
How important is this process, as people would want this to be a Fiji-led process? A lot of people are talking about it, but with some guidance from the experts in the field, because the Constitution at the end of the day is the supreme law of the land. We've got to make sure that if we are deciding to look at amendments, what are your thoughts on this, knowing that a Fiji-led process which people want, but we definitely need guidance from experts?
Well, Vijay, first, in answer to that question, I guess the most important point is to mention the last aspect of my lecture from last week, which was, what are the possibilities for change to the amendment arrangements if amendment is impossible? Because, of course, that means you can't amend the amendment provisions. And so you're stuck with the current Constitution forever, or until there's a coup or some other political intervention. So the big choice for Fiji now is, does it stick with this forever Constitution? And no country has ever had a constitution that's lasted unchanged forever. So is that what you want? Or do you want to run the risk of serious danger of a coup or some other form of political intervention? So what I've presented to the public lecture last week was that I think there are a number of ways that the current constitution could be challenged. Many of them are quite technically difficult. It would be hard to spell them out in detail here, but we can explain some of them if you like. But all of them would end up with the existing constitution either declared by a court to be completely invalid and needing to be replaced, or partially invalid. For example, the amendment provisions might be overruled by the court and a more sensible amendment provision inserted, which would then give the current government, the freedom to move to improve the constitution. So there's a number of possibilities. All of them would then see the government having, if they succeeded, all of them would then see the current government having the authority to go ahead and change the constitution by whatever process they thought fit. Now, given the fact that the previous experience has only two participatory processes, consultative processes, which seem to produce quite good outcomes, you would imagine that the government would want to go back to something like that. I think it's not a matter of expert advice. Whatever process you have, you'll involve experts. But the experts are, including myself, we're technicians. We're there to advise on how you do what you want to do. The big issue first is for the political leaders and the civil leaders in Fiji across all communities to work out what they want. Then the technicians can help.
Good answer. Fiji has had changes to the constitution from 1970. As you said, you've got your stack there. 1970 to the 1990 constitution. 1990 constitution came into force without a parliament, led by, at the time, Sitiveni Rambuka, after the 87 coup, which he also led. Then the 1997 constitution, passed by parliament, Mr. Rambuka then democratically elected and decided that we needed the amendments, went through the proper consultation, public consultation, changes were agreed to by parliament and passed. And then we had the 2012 constitution, which is in the draft form by Professor Yash Ghai and the team, and then the 2013 constitution, which came into force without a parliament in place. Bear in mind, in 2001, after the 2000 coup, there was an attempt to review the constitution, but that failed under the then interim Prime Minister, Mr. Laisenia Garase, because the court ruled that the 1997 constitution was intact and was not abrogated under the Chandrika Prasad case, and that was a historic moment for Fiji as well. Now, based on all these changes, what are your thoughts on this, as we have mainly had changes after a coup or political upheaval because a group was unhappy with what is in the constitution?
Yeah, correct. That's been the most difficult situation for Fiji. The role of Parliament, I agree, is very important. And of course, with the Ghai Commission draft, the original proposal in the decrees passed by the Bainimarama military regime, they passed two separate decrees, one establishing the commission and one providing for an elected constituent assembly. And so it was always intended by the government and by the commission that it wasn't going to be just what the commission recommended that would be made into the constitution. Instead, it would be debated for however long was needed by the elected constituent assembly. But when the Ghai draft was burnt and rejected, formally rejected, the government repealed the decree on the Constituent Assembly, and they went ahead and made a draft of the 2013 Constitution, which, by the way, got published on the same day as the repeal of the Constituent Assembly decree, and a new decree was passed giving them the authority to go ahead and make their own constitution. Curiously enough, I don't think this is widely recognised, Vijay, in the new decree they passed, giving them the authority to make the constitution, the decree said they were to receive the Ghai Commission's draft and amend it. They didn't. They'd already rejected the Ghai Commission draft, and if you read the 2013 Constitution, it bears almost no resemblance to the Ghai Commission draft. So it's quite arguable, and this is one of the lines of argument I mentioned last week in the lecture, it's quite arguable that they did not obey their own decree in making the Constitution.
Which opens up a whole new legal argument. You're watching Fiji Village Straight Talk. I'm Vijay Narayan. We'll be back after this break.
Oh my gosh! Oh, what's in the box?
You're probably wondering, what's in the box? Well, if you must know, it's actually me. Before you call the police, I'm actually an app. The all-new Fiji Village app. Here's an update. See what I did there? I gave you an update. What's new? Well, for starters, I look different. My new layout also comes with stories if you're looking for something short and sweet. I will bring you the latest news on the dot so you stay updated. You're welcome. You don't have to go anywhere for content because I bring the content to you. Not only can you listen to your favorite radio stations, you can also watch online video content. Which reminds me, do you love sports? Well, guess what? With the Fiji Village app, you can stay up to date with your favorite sports and scoreboards, no matter where you are. Your #1 news website just got better with an app. Download and get updated now.
Breakfast with Budana Penny and Tifa. Good yadras.
It's 7:21 and it's turned up Tuesday. Turn up.
Good youngers, let's go. Hey! Hi! We just wanted to take this moment to say a big binakawakalibu.
For making us the #1 radio station in Fiji.
Your sport means the world to us.
Thank you for listening in day after day.
I like listening to Breakfast on FM 96. I love all the songs that they play, and FM 96 is mine.
We love FM 96. FM 96.
Our #1.
One thing that draws me to FM 96 is that the content is relatable. They do play all the music that I love.
Part of FM 96 is listening to Penny the Pensaris. And they make fun about my forehead because it shines brighter than the content.
And you have made us a part of your daily routine.
And we couldn't be more grateful.
Thank you for making us #1 in Fiji!
That sounds right. Okay, I got it. If I could turn back time, if I could find a way.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left. Sick and tired of hearing all these people talk about what's the deal with this pop life and when is it gonna fade out? The sun is fading away.
If I could reach the stars,
Bum, 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 bum. I don't know the rest of the words.
I'd give them all to you.
As the June light turns to moonlight. La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la, la la la. Loving you is all I ever need. Making love with you is all good.
I think.
Limas? Sabi mama na 5. Bebe, kenapa ya? Gol.
Welcome back. You're watching Fiji Village Straight Talk. I'm Vijay Narayan and we are talking to the Australian National University's Professor Anthony Regan, and this is about constitution making. Professor Regan, a widely accepted, internationally recognized principle of good constitutional design, you have said, is the need for balance between it being rigid and flexible in a national constitution. What are your thoughts on the Fijian constitutional process? Because as far as being rigid is concerned, we just talked about how rigid it is, and then if we do not have that flexibility, what are some of the dangers that we may encounter?
The biggest danger, if you make a constitution impossible or virtually impossible to change, is that first of all, if change is not possible and never occurs, you're locked in to set of relationships that never change. I mean, for example, in Fiji, because the colonial regime brought in a large number of Indian people, that's left Fiji in the approach to independence with roughly equivalent Itauke and Indo-Fijian populations. It's easy to blame the Indians for being here because it affects the Itauke population in their land, in their culture and so on. But you can't really blame them. They were brought here by the colonial regime and it wasn't really possible for them ever to return. They never had a choice. So the difficulty that Fiji has faced ever since the lead up to independence is how to work out the relationship between those two communities. And unfortunately, in the 1970 Constitution, the 1990 Constitution, there was a very strong focus on the separation of the communities. The communities had communal rights over participation in Parliament, over access to land and so on. The 97 Constitution the Reeves Commission tried to move away from that model to a more integrative approach with less focus on communal rights and more focus on individual human rights. But a parliamentary committee amended what the Reeves Commission had proposed, which was a large move to more integration, and they scaled it back so that there was much more communal by increasing the number of seats that each community alone.
There was only 20 open seats.
That's right, and the rest were communal. The good thing about the current constitution, I guess, the most positive aspect of it, is that it's moved towards more integration. There's no longer communal seats. That's probably a positive thing. It's more in line with what the 97 Constitution, it goes a bit further than the 97 Constitution as recommended by Reeves. But there's a number of problems with what they did in moving to full integration. The electoral system has a lot of difficulties. As I'm sure you're aware, with the particular form of proportional representation that's been established. So there's no longer any link to geographic constituencies and communities.
You just have one constituency, which is Fiji, so people do not know where to go. And there's the relatability of the MPs compared to the past, where people knew, okay, this person is representing me, he's from Ba, he stood for this seat. All of those are gone.
And the open list system means that a very large proportion of members are getting into Parliament on the basis of one highly visible candidate. So the Fiji First Party representatives in the Parliament elected in 2022, most of them got almost no votes, very low number of votes, under 1,000. So they're not necessarily highly popular, visible representatives of the people. So there's a lot of problems with that. So, in answer to your question, if you can't amend the Constitution, you're stuck with that, no matter what the problems are that have become evident. They had if you like, a good intent of making a more integrative process of elections so that the communities mixed more. They are less separated. That was the goal, but it's been done in a way which creates a lot of problems. So are you going to be stuck with that forever? That's the risk. Or you run the risk of another coup. And remember, coups in Fiji have not just been by the military. The Spate coup was led by a failed businessman. Yes, there were military involved, but it wasn't a military determined coup. The other two coups, the other main coups, were military. But Fiji has a record of interventions to change things, which would make you a little nervous of what's possible in the future if we're locked into the current constitution forever.
Exactly, and we wouldn't want another coup of any sort in Fiji, because we've seen the heavy price that has been paid by this beautiful country. On and on, and in 54 years, what we could have been or should have been, and to really concentrate on the positive steps, as you said, your paper is talking about the future, the best way to go. In April this year, Professor Regan, the Supreme Court said that, as they understand it, the Fijian Constitution of 2013 was not the result of the type of public process that preceded the adoption of the United States Constitution. The judges said the 2013 Constitution was the work of a relatively small group of officials, of which former Attorney General Ayaset Kayum was one. What are your thoughts on the court's comments that our current Constitution was not the result of the type of public process that preceded the adoption of, say, the US Constitution?
The court's ruling was very interesting because they were concerned about the fact that there hadn't been participation and consultation. And they mentioned that in the context of trying to understand particular provisions of the Constitution, which they pointed out didn't make proper English sense. The wrong wording had been put in. It was an incomprehensible provision about the grounds for excluding people from holding office as a judge or as a public prosecutor. And so the court was concerned that there hadn't been a participatory process. The implication being, if there had been such a process, you would have been less likely to have a serious error in the wording of the Constitution. So the court wasn't making a general ruling about the invalidity of the Constitution because it hadn't been the subject of consultation. It was much more narrow than that, but it was at least indicating that the court had some concerns. And the court even commented that on that basis and on the basis of other issues, the full supremacy of the Constitution had to be questioned. So that's suggesting that the courts may well be open, the Superior Court in particular, this is the Supreme Court, may be open to thinking about what's wrong with the process, what's wrong with the Constitution. And in that context, Vijay, I should mention that another ground for possible challenging of the validity of the Constitution concerns the fact that in the decrees passed by the military regime, unilaterally of course, there was no parliament, but in their decrees providing for the constitution making process in 2012 and 2013, there were 2 stated values and 11 stated binding principles that they said had to be met by the Constitution, and they included full protection of human rights, full independence of the judiciary, good governance, and so on. Now, some of them were clearly met by the content of the 2013 Constitution, but I think it's very arguable that a number of them were not, including independent judiciary, human rights protection, good governance, and others. And on the grounds that their own constitution does not meet the requirements of the principles that they laid down, the Constitution could be open to challenge. And that was one of the points I made last week. And by the way, Vijay, there are a number of other lines of argument that would give a court, a thoughtful court, like the one that made the ruling you referred to, grounds for overturning the Constitution. Another one concerns the decision of the Supreme Court in Karase and Chowdhury back in 2009, where the Court of Appeal said that the coup of 2006 overturning the Constitution, even though Bainimarama at the time said the coup was being held to protect the Constitution, I've lost my train of thought there, Vijay.
The court had said in 2009 in Garase and Chowdhury
that's
case.
right. Sorry, the court ruled, thank you for reminding me, the court ruled that the 97 Constitution was still in place. And it was in part based on the same sort of reasoning as in the case of Chandrika Prasad that you mentioned earlier. Both courts said that it was not possible to overturn the constitution through a coup. So it's quite arguable that the 97 constitution is still in place. There are other issues about whether there's been acquiescence of the people of Fiji in relation to the 2013 constitution, but we can come to those.
Yeah, well, acquiescence is, again, how do you define acquiescence if it was forced down on the people? That's an interesting argument in itself. The legitimacy of the 2013 constitution has been questioned by most party leaders in all elections since 2013. Our first one after 2006 was in 2014. In most countries, that might give the current government a mandate to advance proposal for constitutional change. Do you think this can happen in Fiji?
Yes, definitely. There's two main constitutional grounds on which a court will determine that a coup is valid. One is what's called the doctrine of necessity, where if there's a terrible emergency which can't be dealt with using the processes under the Constitution, then a coup can be held, but it's for very limited purposes. It can't overturn the constitutional order. It has to return to the constitutional order quickly. The other is acquiescence, where the coup has replaced everything. There's no government to challenge the coup makers, and so on. But acquiescence is only possible if the people have willingly accepted the imposition of the new regime. In a situation like Fiji, where all of the opposition political parties from 2013 onwards have stated their intent of changing the constitution. That was included in the 2022 election preparations and debates, and in the statement of the principles of the coalition reached in advance of the elections. So it's very clear there's been a constant call for change. But more important still, there's been, in that whole period from 2006 until 2022 election, there was a serious limitation on the possibilities of public debate. People could not express their views. There was a serious media control through the media decree and through other actions, which I'm sure you're well aware of, putting all sorts of pressure on the media. So it's very difficult to say that there's any evidence of acquiescence on the part of the population of Fiji. So I'd say that any court looking at that doctrine of acquiescence would say it doesn't apply in Fiji. And more generally, I think you could say to any court that any government today wanting to make a change has a mandate, because they've argued for that mandate ever since 2013. That mandate didn't come to them initially, partly because of the repression and the very skewed electoral system under the 2013 constitution.
The issue in relation to any changes to the current constitution, the amendment provision, you talked about it a bit. Do you believe it would make sense to legally challenge the way an amendment should be made? Because it is impossible. 75% of support in Parliament, 75% of support of registered voters in a referendum, where we are barely getting even 80%. We're lucky if people turn out to vote, because voting is not compulsory. Do you believe that there is room to move in terms of taking legal action in relation to that?
There's definitely room to move. There's a number of lines of argument that I think a reasonable court would be willing to consider. And it's far better, I think, and it would be a strong argument to the court. It's far better, especially in a situation like Fiji, where, as the Supreme Court said in that same case that you mentioned, the main history of constitutional change in Fiji has been through coups and other political interventions, not through constitutional arrangements that reflect the wishes of the people and are therefore done in a peaceful way. So the choice for the court is going to be, really, do we lock Fiji into the long-term commitment to only using coups and other actions to change the constitution, or do we look at the possibilities of either reversing the current constitution or amending the current constitution? And there are a number of lines of argument. There is even a line of argument, Vijay, which would say that there has been a valid exercise by the military of emergency powers under a doctrine of necessity, but now it's time to return to more normality. And you might even get the court to agree that you could keep the current constitution as part of what's been done under emergency powers, but amend it. Just change the amendment provisions so that the current regime could amend the current constitution and make it more reasonable. So there's an English saying I'm sure you're aware of, that there's plenty of ways to skin a cat. Well, there's quite a few ways to challenge the constitution and to find a new way of framing the future governance arrangements in Fiji.
You're watching Fiji Village Trade Talk. I'm Vijay Narayan. We'll be back after this break.
आप देख रहे हैं इसी संडास जो हमारे सुपरस्टार ब्रश अभी आकर इस्तेमाल करेगा किसी वक्त अभी लो आ गया सुपरस्टार ब्रश
Not following me
सर
again.
सर सर जनता जानना चाहते हैं सर सर अगर जनता जानना चाहते हैं सर are the rumors true sir hopefully bye सर अब आप देख रहे हैं दफ्तर के स्टूडियो में हम भर चुके हैं जेसिका जनता जानना चाहते हैं जेसिका जनता जानना चाहते हैं कि आप कौन सी मेकअप लगाते हैं
आज मैंने तो कोई मेकअप नहीं लगाया
लगता है लगा ले
How dare you DA
तो आप देख रहे हैं यहाँ एसएन का गाड़ी पड़ा है काफी गर्जी है लेकिन एसएन साहब एसएन सर अमेरिका से आए हुए सर अमेरिका का जनता जानना चाहते हैं सर आप हमेशा काला चश्मा क्यों पहनते हैं सर
तो सफेद चश्मा कहाँ मिली सफेद चश्मा देखा कहीं तुम
तुकता काय को है
क्या आप भी परेशान हैं? क्या आपकी भी लाइफ में ऐसी ही टेंशन है? आपकी परेशानी को कम करने के लिए आ रहा हूं मैं बहुत ही जल्द आपको हंसाने के लिए रेडियो सरगम और रेडियो सरगम फेसबुक पेज पर बहुत ही जल्द वहीं पर मिलेंगे। हेलो अरे यार
Dimas, sa mama na lima?
Ewe kenapa ya?
Gol. Gol.
Welcome back. You're watching Fiji Village Straight Talk. I'm Vijay Narayan, and in studio tonight we have the Australian National University Professor of Constitutional Law, Anthony Regan, and we're talking about constitution making and the challenges that exist. Now, Professor Regan, what are your thoughts of an inclusive process, as there are differing views on issues like all citizens of Fiji to be called Fijian, Fiji to be a secular state, there should be no discrimination based on race, gender and sexual orientation? I raise this issue because a lot of people, after they heard that there may be a review of the Constitution, they're wondering if some of the things like that has brought people together in some way or dispels all these issues in relation to discrimination may come back. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, firstly, although the 2013 Constitution has a good and very liberal Bill of Rights, all of the human rights, and that's protecting people from discrimination is one of them, there's problems. The Bill of Rights can be overridden by an ordinary law of Parliament at any time, which means that they're not really constitutionally protected. It means there's a statement of a right, but it can be undercut any time.
There are a lot of limitations?
There aren't at the moment, but any regime in the future that wanted to limit them has a virtually unfettered power under the Fiji Constitution. And that's not how constitutional rights are usually framed. The whole purpose of putting them into the Constitution is to make sure that they can't be undercut just by the government of the day. So the Fiji Constitution, although it has a good set of rights stated, they're very precarious. Any new regime that was, for example, say a highly Itauke focused, traditional Itauke values government came to power, they wouldn't have to amend the Constitution to change the rights of people and to take away protection, for example, from Indo-Fijians from being discriminated against. They could do it by an ordinary act of Parliament. And if you've got a government that's got plenty of numbers in the House, they can do what they like. So the constitutional protection is not strong. What you would want in a highly participatory consultative process would be to make sure that the concerns of all are put on the table, and that a commission, a constitutional commission, for example, together with the Parliament or an elected constituent assembly, or it doesn't have to be with the Commission. There are other ways to come up with the proposals for the Constitution that go to the legislature to be framed. But however you do it, you want to make sure all groups have a chance for their voices to be heard, and then you frame the Constitution as much as possible to provide a balance between all the different concerns. So I would have thought there's not much risk that the current levels of protection would be undermined. What you would actually do by a new constitution making process would be to get the same set of rights, basically, perhaps with some changes, properly protected.
Let's talk about inclusive process. We've talked about the military. It led the coups in 87, 2 coups in 87, one in May, one in September. Then we had the 2000 coup, then we had 2006. Of course, the military then, when the coups finished and when we did have constitutions, immunity provisions were included to safeguard those who had conducted the coups. That's from 87 right up to 2006. Then we have the section 131(2) of the Constitution, of the 2013 Constitution, states that it shall be the overall responsibility of the Republic of Fiji military forces to ensure at all times the security, defense and well-being of Fiji and all Fijians. A lot is being talked about in relation to this constitutional provision. People have called for this to be reviewed, while others say this gives good security to them. What are your thoughts on how these sections can be handled, knowing that you have handled conflict resolution and post-conflict resolution?
Well, the first thing to state is that on the face of it, that section, that subsection, does not give the military a role of being guardian of the Constitution. Being asked to look after the welfare of the people and the country is not very different from what most constitutions say, if they say anything about the military, and many don't. The aim of the military is, in most countries, to look after the needs of the people by protecting them from outside threats. The military is generally not tasked with looking after inside problems, except in very narrow circumstances, such as in states of emergency, and then only usually, as under the Fiji constitution, only to a very limited extent for the period of the emergency, to the extent that it's necessary to deal with the emergency. So you can't just do anything as the military. It's got to be as permitted by the legislation in the emergency orders. So those words, on the face of it, do not give the Fiji military that role of guardians of the Constitution. And you would think if it was intended to give them that role, that it would have done so explicitly. So we're only looking at that section, 1312, and seeing it as giving the military the role of guardian of the Constitution, because that's what the military proposed in their submission to the Guy Commission. They put in a huge submission, over 100 pages, and that's what they argued for. And of course, since then, the military have on occasion said that their role is to be guardians of the Constitution, and they've justified particular things they've done at various times. Not very often, but just on a few times since 2013. So I think it's wrong to say that that section gives them that authority. I would say that it's very unwise to give a military that authority. The military should normally be, as I say, focused on outside threats, and clearly the Fiji military are well equipped for that. I've dealt with the Fiji military in Bougainville in Papua New Guinea on a number of occasions. Very professional, very, very important roles they played. So this has nothing to do with the capacity of the Fiji. It's a matter of how you define their role, and giving the Fiji military the role of guarding the Constitution takes them outside the Constitution. It's up to them to decide when there's a threat. It's up to them to decide what to do. So they are then ultimately superior to the government of the day. What do most constitutions do when there's a constitutional dispute, when there's constitutional uncertainty? They give it to the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court or the Appeal Court, the job of dealing with that. And the courts are equipped for evaluating the issues involved. Are the military really equipped to decide when the Constitution's under threat? And are they equipped to make the decisions about what's necessary? I would say there's very serious doubts about that. That's nothing to do with the capacity of the Fiji military. More to do with whether it's an appropriate role for them.
There's certain sections of the Constitution where things have not been implemented. For example, the Accountability and Transparency Commission, yet to be appointed. Freedom of information. Section 150 states a written law shall make provision for the exercise of a member of the public for the right to access to official information. Still not done since 2013. Section 149 states a written law shall establish a code of conduct applicable to the President, Speaker, Deputy Speaker, Prime Ministers, Ministers, Members of Parliament. Not done. And the Code of Conduct by the Accountability and Transparency Commission. These are all yet to be implemented. What are your thoughts?
I'd say that's part of a more general problem in the Constitution. The regime, the previous Attorney General, often claimed that this was the most democratic constitution in the world, or certainly the most democratic constitution Fiji has ever had. Well, that ignored the problems in the electoral system we're talking about. It ignored the fact that on the accountability institutions, the executive government has a huge degree of control over their appointment and dismissal, which means effectively, if they want to exercise it, a lot of control on how they operate. And then in addition, significant aspects of achieving accountability, as you say, have not been implemented. So it's a pattern, a picture of trying to avoid the accountability of the executive government. The Constitution concentrates power in the executive government, particularly in the Prime Minister and in the Attorney General. The Prime Minister in the 2013 Constitution is mentioned, I think, over 150 times. The Attorney General is mentioned about 80 times. Now this is very unusual to single out the two particular officers in the executive. The normal Constitution gives powers to the executive and leaves it up to the executive how to divide.
Put those positions, Prime Minister and Attorney General, to make majority of the decisions.
Exactly, including the decisions about the appointment of all the accountability institutions, and of course, which parts of the accountability system get implemented. And so they haven't bothered because accountability appears not to be a serious priority.
And we really need a lot of accountability, because even right now, some of the reports that are being tabled in Parliament are coming from 2006-2007 audit reports or annual reports are now tabled now, many years later. The other issue is in relation, from your perspective, do you feel that the will of the people is reflected in the 2013 Constitution? If it was done by a small group of people, forced down on the citizens without Parliament, and then adopted in Parliament after the 2014 general elections, after that we had the 2014, 2018, 22 general elections under the Constitution, do you believe that there has been acceptance, and where to from here if there are moves to make amendments?
I don't know to what extent the content of the Constitution reflects the will of the people, but given the fact that it was made by such a small group of people led by the then Attorney General, it would be a miracle if it fully represented the interests of all parties. I think the 97 Reeves Commission and the 2012 Guy Commission provided examples of how you could get as many people as possible involved and as many groups and interest groups involved so that their views could be taken into account. That process was deliberately thrown out by the regime in 2013. So it would be a miracle if the Constitution really reflected the views of the people. Does the Constitution record of having 3 elections reflect real acceptance? As we discussed earlier, I don't think it does, because there was such a clamp on public debate and discussion. There was an electoral system that was skewed to benefit the regime. I think it was a shock to the regime when the electoral system didn't work in their favour in 2022. And of course, that was only by the skin of Rambuka's teeth that it didn't work in favour of the regime. So I think there are avenues for rethinking. Some of them are highly technical legal arguments, some of them are very obvious, like the possibility of the 97 Constitution still being in operation, but perhaps with modifications due to a state of emergency perspective. There are options, and it'll be a matter of considerable interest to all of us to see whether the current government is willing to explore some of those options.
The best options are to take it through the court process.
Yes, that would be the simplest. Anything else could be quite difficult. There have been people suggesting, all in good faith of course, that you simply have a referendum. But you'd run the risk of holding the referendum without going through the process for amendment that the Constitution lays down. In other words, first of all, a 3/4 absolute majority vote, and secondly, meeting the 3/4 of registered voters requirement. So a referendum on its own which doesn't comply with the Constitution could well be overturned by a court. So it's better, I think, probably to go to the Supreme Court, which you can do under the Constitution for constitutional interpretation. Now, you'd be in a very strange situation because you'd be going to the Supreme Court, which has been established under the 2013 Constitution, and asking that court to rule that the Constitution they're operating under is unconstitutional. So that's a difficult situation, and not many precedents anywhere around the world. But I would mention that the Indian Supreme Court in particular has developed a doctrine which has been adopted in a number of other countries, which allows valid constitutional amendments, properly passed by Parliament, meeting all of the procedural requirements. They are declared unconstitutional because they have not met the basic principles and values that underlie the Constitution. And I think you'd be arguing something similar here. You'd be saying to the court, there are some underlying principles that universally should apply. Some of them are clear in the regime's own decrees about the constitution-making process. So some of those universal values are not reflected. And you could be asking them essentially on technical grounds that we've already argued to look at the possible unconstitutionality of the 2013 Constitution.
My final question, Professor Regan, will you be assisting the Fiji government in any way based on public comments already made by the Attorney General and others, including the Prime Minister, that there is a plan to review the Constitution?
I've had no involvement in any sort of official process. I certainly talk to people, but there's been no request for me to be involved, and I'm probably not the ideal person because my knowledge of Fiji politics is not very strong. I've followed Fiji closely for many years, but mainly on the constitutional political issues. The people that need to make the decisions here are Fijians. And then, as I mentioned earlier, then you can get in some technicians and find the best way ahead.
That was the Australian National University Professor of Constitutional Law, Anthony Regan. Thank you very much for your time. Great talking to you and sharing your knowledge in relation to constitutional lawmaking and the difficulties that Fiji faces at the moment. I'm sure the viewers tonight enjoyed the insight, the valuable insight, and any final comments from you to the people of Fiji, Professor Regan.
Thank you, Vijay, for inviting me. I'm very glad to have had this discussion. The issues are complicated and uncomfortable, but I think the main concern is the one that you've mentioned several times, the need for wide engagement so that the people of Fiji feel committed to their constitution, whatever that is.
And that's your show for tonight. Until next week, have a great evening.